Hello, good day, everybody, and welcome to my office hours. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, as well as one of the chef instructors in your courses. Today, as you know, we've got open office hours, which means you get a chance to ask just about any question you want regarding food and cooking, and I'll ask you to focus your questions in that domain. Without getting into medical questions, for example. And as we get started today, I'll mention just a couple of things. On your screen on the right-hand side, kind of up at the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a text box that says "Add question here." That's where you can add questions and comments as well, so that you can be a part of this dialogue, part of this conversation that we're going to have. And your question or your comment will make its way to me, okay? And then the other thing that you'll note is that there are already a number of questions populating that right-hand side in the gray boxes. And you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of each of those questions, there's a heart-shaped icon. If you find a favorite question that you want me to respond to sooner than later, you can click on that icon and it'll push it up in the list, okay? Now, without, further delay, I'll go ahead and jump in since we've got quite a number of questions to attend to, all right? And so the first one, this is from Tony. So what's the best way to wash fruit and vegetables? I read that you shouldn't use detergent, but does water alone get rid of dirt, pesticides, etc.? Does scrubbing or placing in vinegar help? So excellent question. This is definitely one, I think, on the minds of a lot of folks these days. And I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways. Number one, there's a link that Patrick has loaded up for us just above your question, Tony. That'll take us to an article, an online article by NPR. This is not a new article. It dates from 2007, but the content is relevant as anything else I think you're going to find on the internet. And it walks through those topics that you covered. In terms of, does a little scrubbing with a dry towel help? Answer is yes. Does just water help? Answer is yes. Does a vinegar water solution help? The answer there is yes. That's probably the best option in terms of cutting down on a bacteria count or microorganism count. And so do take a look at that and see how you want to incorporate that into your routine. And I think the basic ratio is a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 parts water, 1 part vinegar. And I think the vinegar is generally up to you. Probably the most common and affordable vinegar is your least expensive distilled white vinegar. Balsamic vinegar and some of these other varieties are not necessary for this application. I think that'll get you right down the path to just feeling better about how you handle the produce each day. All right, thank you. And next from Sharon. Let's see. Hello. So thanks so much for these open office hours. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. I wash my herbs right before using, and even though I dry them on a towel, they're still damp and clump when minced. So they don't look great as garnished. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, I've got a couple of ideas, a couple of things that I do. The first one is if you've got a salad spinner handy, it's nice to put your herbs in a salad spinner and give that a spin, stop it, and kind of rearrange the herbs, and then give it another spin. And that usually releases a second round of water. And then the other method is that I'll get that bunch of herbs after I've rinsed it, and I'll slap it a bit on a towel. And that movement itself sort of loosens up the leaves, the sprigs, and allows more water to be released. So those are my two methods, very quick and easy for either home or commercial application. All right. All right. Next up, let's see. What is the best way to clean mushrooms you buy from the supermarket? So there are, at least a couple of approaches to the mushroom question. And part of this depends upon your personal preference. I hear pros and cons both ways. I use both techniques on occasion. The first one is to do a quick rinse under water, rubbing quickly on any of the residue that you see adhering to the mushrooms. A lot of folks cringe when I say run your mushrooms underwater because they're afraid that the mushrooms will very quickly absorb water. And while I agree that mushrooms may absorb water after some prolonged soaking, but I find no problems with a quick rinse under running water. As I usually use my fingertips. That's usually adequate to loosen up any of that debris. On occasion, I'll use a brush. And then the second approach is to use a brush on dry mushrooms. And I'll do this once in a while. I think I use this technique more often after I've gone foraging for mushrooms. So at that point, they're still a little bit damp. You get things like small pine needles that adhere to the mushroom, and so a gentle brushing will pull those off very nicely. And but even then, for you foragers out there, just a quick rinse again underwater, and then under running water helps very nicely, and then let them dry. You can gently towel dry them, which I do sometimes, or you can set them out and let them air dry. And that's been successful for me. All right, thank you. And the next question, do you wash all vegetables and fruits before storing in the fridge or just as you use them? This is really personal preference. And, I can go either way. I think what we do at home here is a little bit of both, actually. We have a lot of fruit, that we use each day that sits out on the counters. So it's kind of a grab and go sort of an item. And those are all pre-washed and set out so that it's convenient for us. Now, there are some other items like bags of Yukon Gold potatoes that sit downstairs where it's a little bit cooler. And those are not cleaned in advance. In terms of things that go into the refrigerator, let's see. So, some of the larger things, let's say eggplant, for example, carrots even, we've been rinsing those before we put them into the fridge. Herbs, I generally tend to just put into the fridge, and then we'll rinse them prior to using. Just because this depends on the herb, but I generally don't want to introduce any more moisture in order to prolong the shelf life. Now, having said that, even without rinsing, it's important to keep an eye on those herbs in the fridge to allow them to breathe. If you see condensation on the bag or the wrapper that protects the herbs, sometimes the leaves themselves will become very moist and start to clump, in which case they need to air out even in the fridge before you've washed them. So those are just a couple of additional thoughts that I'll tag onto the answer to your question, Carol. All right, thank you. And the next one, what's the best way to ferment vegetables? Okay, so this is a much longer sort of a discussion. So what I am going to do is generally refer you to a very nice discussion on a favorite blog of mine called Serious Eats. And Marisha, if you want to contact me through student support at support@rouxbe.com, I'm happy to send you the direct link to that article. Or you can always spend a couple of minutes and do a Google search for that on the Serious Eats website or blog. Okay, they've got just a very nice article that'll get you going in that department. All right, next up from Lorena. Hello. I just started my new knife set. Excellent, congratulations. I use my honing steel every time I use them. Is it better to do it before or after using? Do you hone serrated knives? Lastly, what's the best use of a bird's beak paring knife? Okay, so the first question is, do you hone on the steel before or after using it? And my answer is yes. The general guidance here would be to steel your knife before you use it each day. And then, also, if you're doing a lot of work, you can steel it in between some of that work as needed. And then, optionally, I'll say, there are folks out there that will steel their knives before they put it away in the, at the end of the shift, so to speak. I guess this is restaurant talk here. But for sure, at the beginning of your work, you want to put your knife on the steel, hone it, get that edge nice and straight, so you've got maximum cutting efficiency to start out your day. All right. And the second part, do you hone a serrated knife? I do, yeah. And yeah, I mean, I hone both sides. Very well. Yeah, I guess it depends. Some serrated knives are serrated on both sides. Some are serrated on only one side, and then the opposing side is flat. And it's much easier to hone that flat side. But yes, I will hone a serrated knife as well, and I find it to be helpful for sure. And then the bird's beak knife. Yeah, so the bird's beak paring knife for me is used to what we call turn potatoes, or to create tournée potatoes or other root vegetables. And to turn a potato means that you've got your potato commonly, but it could be anything else. Usually it's a root vegetable. It could be a carrot or a beet or something else. But you're gonna take that potato and you're gonna cut it down so that it's more of a barrel shape, and that's a classic knife cut, actually. And it's not one that we teach at Rouxbe, but it's one that we sometimes see in restaurants. There's a lot of labor involved, a lot of waste involved, so we don't see it very often in restaurants anymore. Although I'm always very excited when I see that somebody has taken the time to tournée vegetables for me. But that's what I use it for. And that curved bird beak makes it just a little bit easier to pull that knife around that curved cut that you're making on that potato. And that's about the only time I use that. But if you find some other application that it's comfortable with, by all means, give it some exercise. All right, thank you. All right, next up, another question from Carol. Do you use agave syrup and maple syrup interchangeably? Does one work better for some recipes than others? Is one less processed and so more preferred over the other? Let's see. So are these two syrups used interchangeably? They certainly can be, right? I think one of the things to keep in mind when we make any sort of substitution is the accompanying flavor, right? So there's a taste, right, such as sweet, sour, salty, bitter, astringent, pungent, these sort of tastes. And then there are flavors, such as lemony or orange-like or mapley, right? And so both agave and maple syrup give the sweet taste, but they have different accompanying flavors. So are they interchangeable? Generally, yes, as a sweetener. The second part is, which flavor do you want to go with that sweetness? So, the answer to the question is it interchangeable? or are they interchangeable? Sometimes, right? But that's going to be your personal call. And does one work better than others in certain recipes? I would imagine that there would be examples where one might be preferable. I don't have any examples that come to mind right now, but possibly so. All right. And then moving on to the third part of your question, is one less processed than the other? The processing is a little bit different, but they both involve heat. There is some transitioning of complex sugars into more simple sugars that takes place, as well as reduction of the base liquid into a thicker, desired viscosity of the end product. And so in that sense, there are some similarities. And, so is one preferred over the other in terms of degree of processing? In my opinion, no. But that becomes a personal decision, right? If you want to dig a little bit deeper into how one or the other is processed. And I'm also aware that there are some different processes involved for these items. So take a look at that and see if there's something that's particularly important to you that jumps out. Okay. And next question, for cooking in general, is mise en place always necessary? For instance, after verifying you have all the ingredients, is it necessary to measure all out into separate bowls when preparing a smoothie in a blender? What's the benefit? Okay, so yeah, good question here. So for home cooking, and that's generally what we're talking about here, right? Although I always come from the perspective of restaurant efficiency as well. But generally for home cooking, in the scenario that you're talking about, Donna, mise en place to the extent of placing, each smoothie ingredient into a separate bowl, no, probably not necessary. That's going to be totally up to you whether you want to follow through to that extent or not. I think certainly to have your fruit in front of you is probably in my opinion, a good idea. It's part of the habit that I have as mise en place in all aspects of my life is kind of ingrained into me now. So, having all those things out in front of me is something that I do. And then assembly is very quick. But again, that's going to be a personal call, just, how much of the discipline of mise en place you want to incorporate into some of your tasks or all of your tasks at home. Now, in a commercial setting where I think efficiency is more important because time equals money in that context, I would bring everything out, or I would train my staff to bring all the ingredients out, run through the process of making a smoothie, or at least having those things stored efficiently, meaning within probably just one step of the blender, and that sort of setup I think you would see in a restaurant that specializes in smoothies, for example. Okay, you'll see that sort of efficiency in the kitchen setup. All right, so I hope that's helpful for you. Thank you. Next up, I have an old cast iron pan that's been in my family for years. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes not. Should I re-season it? And if so, how is the most effective way to do that? I always scope out with water, not use soap, and lightly oil before storing. Okay, so it sounds like the basic handling of the cast iron is correct, is on par. In terms of reseasoning, I would suggest that you consider reseasoning, especially if it sticks sometimes. Perhaps a refreshening of the patina might be a good thing. So the general approach here is to oil the pan and then place it into a hot oven. and 350 to 400 degrees. Those are temperatures that I've used in the past. And then you let that bake on for a good 20, 30 minutes or so. That's again what I have done in the past. There's certainly variation in this process, and then you can do that multiple times. So it could be 2 or 3 or 4 times that you will bake on that layer of oil, and then continue to gently care for it, as you have mentioned in your message here. As far as some more detail, okay, in the reseasoning process is concerned, I will direct you to a very nice entry in again one of my favorite food blogs, Serious Eats. And if you want to send me a message via student support, right, at support@rouxbe.com, I'd be happy to send you the direct link to that article. All right, thank you. All right, next question. Why do you start boiling water with cold water when beginning with hot water from the tap would be faster? What effect does it have on the end result? I think for most people, it's one of getting the cleanest flavor right from the tap. Very often when we draw hot water from the tap, it picks up some flavor from the pipes. Especially for the folks that use a water tank, a hot water tank, over a period of time, brown algae grows on the inside of a water tank. That's typical. And if some of you were to see that, you might be kind of grossed out by it. It gets to be kind of heavy. And there are people that want to avoid perhaps some of that as well. But I think mostly it's a flavor issue. If we're starting with cold water, we pull less of flavors out of the plastic or metal pipes. It does take longer, but that's going to be the reason. I guess the second part of your question here is what effect has it had on the end result? It just is going to give you a cleaner flavor. Now, I guess you can ask, so will those flavors carry through to the end? And that depends on the preparation, right? If let's say you're using it to make something that's very light in flavor, possibly somebody with a sensitive palate could pick up some of those flavors. But if it's going to be the water is going to be incorporated into a much more intensely flavored gravy or stock or something like that, then maybe you won't notice it. All right, thanks. All right, next up, I'm so bored with the mush aspect of plant food. I do not cook with oil. Any suggestions on how to get a meatier dish with anything other than tempeh? I also don't eat wheat, seitan. Okay. Well, let's see here. This is something that I hear every once in a while. I think there are definitely folks whose palate gets tired of one-pot meals or simmered dishes or otherwise very common wet aspect of plant-based cooking. And I think first of all, if we start to incorporate more dry heat cooking, that's going to be our first avenue, right? To bring in some firmer textures, less of that wetness that we associate with mush. So there's of course grilling and sautéing. There's going to be baking or roasting as well, and let's see. Okay, so if you're avoiding oil, then deep frying is out. Deep frying can be a great way otherwise to bring in some crunch and some nice variation on the palate. But otherwise, plants as they cook, they're going to soften, right? Fibers soften, and that's what brings us to a point in the cooking spectrum that makes a vegetable item, comfortable on the palate. So to some degree, you're going to get some softness, I think, in with most of these cooking methods, right? Whether it's a dry heat method or a moist heat cooking method. But again, we can control some of the dryness and therefore some of the firmness, right? Some of that's going to depend on what vegetable that we choose as well, as some of them do get softer or mushier as they near degrees of doneness, especially full doneness on that spectrum of cooking. Another thing to keep in mind here is that if we can incorporate other dried items, sometimes these are baked items that have a light cracker, crunchy-like aspect to them. Sometimes they are dehydrated items that take on a light, crunchy texture. And we can introduce these to the dinner table or to a plate, or we can construct a dish that has this element of crunch to it. Another way to get some crunch or more texture into a preparation is to incorporate nuts and seeds. You're using the word meaty, and I understand what that means. I think of some of the larger nuts, let's say pecans and walnuts, maybe Brazil nuts, as lending some meaty, sort of chewability to a dish, which lends some satisfaction to me as a diner. This is going to be very personal, of course, on an individual basis. So those are a few things that come to mind. And otherwise, very often we do have sort of a moist aspect to a lot of the dishes that we do prepare. Okay, but try dry heat cooking, try some dehydrating or some baked crunchy components, and also some larger nuts that could be incorporated to lend some satisfaction. See how that goes for you. All right, we'll move on to the next question. So I recently purchased a Japanese chef's knife. Since it was not cheap, I can imagine. I'd like to ask if it would harm the knife by sharpening it on a high-quality electric knife sharpener as shown on Amazon. Don't feel too confident using a whetstone. Okay, so my quick response is give it a try, right? I haven't used an electric sharpener in a long time. There are some different technology, certainly some newer technology for me on the market today. I'm certainly aware of the consumer reviews of some of these products, which are very good. And so my first response to these sorts of scenarios is to give it a try and see how you like the results, see what it's doing to the knife. I use a stone, and so I tend to lean in that direction. I do understand that if a person is not yet comfortable on a whetstone, that there is a learning curve. And for any of you out there that are keen on learning how to use a whetstone, use a practice knife, something less expensive that you don't mind just kind of goofing around with, taking off lots of metal, having uneven bevels, just kind of banging around on until you can start to even out the movement of your hands and your arms. Because the challenge of a whetstone is that you're trying to move your arms like a jig, like a mechanical jig, which is difficult to do because we move, right, in different ways. And so it's very easy to bring in unevenness to the work that we might do on a knife. So I encourage you to practice on a less expensive knife before you move on to an expensive Japanese knife if you're going to be working with a stone. But once again, I think you could possibly go either way, but give it a try on the electric knife sharpener and see how you like those results. Okay, thank you. All right, next question. Do you have any hints for getting tofu cubes to be more of a crispy, dry texture compared to mushy? I bought extra firm and pressed the water out as instructed, but it still always turns out soft, mushy in consistency. Okay. So, one thing that tofu has a tendency to do when it's heated up is to get softer. So, once we cook it, there's always going to be that inner softness. But one way to add a little element of crunch is to dredge it in some flour, and then hit it in a hard, very hot pan with a little bit of oil. It's going to be a saute at that point. But dredge it in some sort of flour, and I'd say give some different things some tries. So it could be wheat flour. You might try some rice flour, which will give you a much harder, crunchier texture. You want to see if that's too crunchy for you, too tough. You might try a blend of flour and wheat flour and rice flour, and see if there's a happy medium for you. And flour and tofu as well can stick to pans. So you might try a non-stick pan for this sort of application, at least initially. A stainless steel pan or a cast iron pan will usually require a little bit more oil to avoid sticking. Otherwise, that layer of dredging that you've applied to the tofu will peel right off. It'll adhere to the pan, and you'll be standing there with plain old tofu in your hands again. So do be aware of the sticking factor, and consider a non-stick pan for this sort of application. Okay, give that a try and see how you like it. All right, thank you. All right, next question. Whenever I roast asparagus, it gets tender, but it is usually stringy. I've tried thick and thin asparagus. What causes that? Asparagus is fibrous, right? So in order for it to stand up straight as it does, it's got to have a lot of that structure, and that structure comes from all that stringy stuff that you see. And when we cook asparagus via a moist heat method, steaming, or a submersion, simmering method, that type of heat contact will tend to soften the fibers. Okay, versus dry heat methods, which tend to remove or moisture, dehydrate a product, and thereby sort of toughen the fibers. And to some extent, we get to to work with some of that fiberiness of asparagus. Okay, one of the trade-offs. All right, thank you. Next up from Anne. Is there one thing you wish you can incorporate into the professional cook program, but haven't figured out how to replicate online? My quick answer is no. I think that we've designed the pro cook course in a way that is I would say relevant today. And what I mean by relevant is that there is one area of cookery that's not incorporated, and that is the focus on charcuterie, meat, in particular meat charcuterie. And the reason for that is that there's some niches of popularity around charcuterie, but overall, it's not practiced very much. And in fact, many restaurants that do, incorporate charcuterie on a menu are bringing in some high quality products from outside vendors. There are specialty companies that make some excellent salamis and pâtés and these sorts of things that fall under the heading of charcuterie. These old school preservation techniques. And so it's not necessary to make these in-house anymore. So Much of that has been removed from the course to make it more relevant to today's kitchens. But it's not so much that we can't replicate it online. And so, my quick question is that the Pro Cook course I think is a solid course. It's pretty intense, 500 and something tasks, 6 months long, covers a lot of different topics, and I think it gives one a very nice foundation in many different areas of cookery to go on cooking seriously at home, as an amateur home cook. Or as a springboard of sorts to do something professionally, maybe it's small scale catering or product development, starting from a home kitchen or a small business base, or even transition into a restaurant setting and have some confidence around the different skill sets and different ways that foods might be handled. All right, thank you. All right, next up. Is there ever any live cooking classes with an instructor? I appreciate the graded assignments, but would love a live cooking class. To date, I think we've really just started to scratch the surface of the idea of providing live cooking classes. And, we kicked that off a couple of weeks or so ago with Barton Seaver in the Seafood Literacy course, where Barton did live demonstrations for us, and we'll see how that shapes things in the future for how we might do some of these live events. All right, that's a great question. Thank you. All right, next up from Sarah. I know this is a broad topic. What are your tips on making coffee? Sarah, this is a broad topic. I think the first tip, is to use the best quality water that you can. And I don't mean to sound facetious or maybe too obvious, but any of these products that are mostly water, such as coffee or tea, the quality, the flavor, right? Any off flavor. We talked about the flavor of pipes coming through a few minutes ago. That sort of thing becomes very, very important in the coffee world in this case, to address your question. So if you suspect that you've got lots of minerals in your water, or pick up occasional little plasticky hints from plastic pipes in your water, you might think about putting an inline filter in order to have the cleanest water possible. I know folks that will bring in water. These 5-gallon jugs of water specifically for coffee and tea, because they want that cleanest end product. And then beyond that, I think it's using coffee beans that are the freshest. And the freshest means a few different things, right? It means that they've been stored properly in their green state. They have been, handled properly during roasting and post-roasting. And so in other words, marketed quickly and in your hands pretty quickly after roasting. And that you have stored them in the best fashion, which often means in a freezer in order to slow down the staling process. And that you use them very quickly, right? So you don't want to buy beans in very large units necessarily. You want to move through that product so you can maintain the freshness of those different steps along the process. And then, of course, enjoy it. Keep your equipment clean as well. We have coffee grounds that accumulate in coffee grinders and on other tools that we might use. And so it's good to clean those different areas of the coffee making process periodically in order to maintain the freshest flavors. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Tanya. Should honing one's knife be at the same angle as it is sharpened? How many times each side? Lots of variables, of course, but a rough idea would be helpful for me. Okay. So should the angle be at the same angle as it is sharpened? And the, the, uh, the quick answer is yes. But the more in-depth answer is when you're honing is that, this is the edge of your knife, right? Looking along the edge of your knife here. As you use your knife, that top cutting edge rolls over. And this is what gives it a dull feeling, okay, as it loses its edge. And so what the honing process does is the steel hits it on this side and it straightens up that cutting edge, okay? And so what's important when you're honing your knife on the steel each day is that you have this evenness. So in other words, as you use your knife during the day and the edge rolls over a bit and you hone it with your steel, it's possible to over hone it so that it actually rolls over in the other direction. Okay, so you'll need to hit it again with your steel in order to straighten it up. And so this is why it's important to really focus on, is the cutting edge straight up and down or not, more than how many times do I put my knife on the steel. So it's important to, I use my thumb to feel each side of your cutting edge, and you'll feel a little bit of drag right against your finger, and the drag should be even on each side. If it's so rolled over, you'll feel more drag on this side, and it'll feel smooth on the other side. Okay, and in which case you know that you need to hit it with your steel in order to straighten it up. So how many times you need to put it on your steel? Sometimes it's just one time, and sometimes it's very, very delicately one time. You'll need to practice, okay? And the reason for the variable there is that it depends on the hardness of your knife blade. There are different types of metals, of course, and some are softer, some are harder. It depends on the angle of the blade. All right, it depends on the material of the steel and the surface texture on the steel. All those things come together to have different influences as you're honing your knife. Okay, so revisit your question here one more time. Yeah, I think I've answered both parts of your question, and I hope some of that supplemental information is helpful for you too. Okay, the most important thing in summary is that your cutting edge is even and not rolled over, and you have to feel it with your finger. You want even drag on each side. Then you know that you've evenly honed your knife. All right. Thank you. All right, next question. How do you mince or grate ginger easily? It's so fibrous. Can you use the clumps of fiber that come off? What's your strategy? So, I like to use one of these sort of razor sharp grating tools, and Microplane is the brand name that's very commonly used. If you look up Microplane, they have a great website. They shows all kinds of different products. Go to the kitchen tools rather than the woodworking tools, since they make all kinds of different tools. And you'll find a lot of different sizes on their graters for more fine or more coarse work. But there's certainly some products that are perfect for ginger and for garlic, as well as so many other things. And depending on the angle, which side of the ginger you use, the Microplane will cut right through it, or sometimes the fibers bunch up on the Microplane, on the grater. In which case, I will use the fibers. And if I feel the fibers are a little bit long still, I'll put them on a cutting board and put my knife through it just a few times to break down the fiber. And then I'll use all that product in the food. There are certainly some cooking contexts, and these are usually professional contexts where you want, the smoothest, most refined finish on a sauce, for example, in which case a cook or a chef may not use the fiber. But certainly at home, I want to use the fiber, right? Because fiber is my favorite F word. And fiber is so important for our good health that I try to get it wherever I can. And so I'm going to use the fiber from the ginger and anything else in my cooking. All right, thank you. All right, Jane's got 2 knife questions for us. Number 1, are there disadvantages to ceramic knives? And number 2, what's the difference, if any, of the edge produced by a whetstone versus an electric sharpener? Okay, a lot of knife questions today. I like it. Question number 1, Jane, are there disadvantages to ceramic knives? In my experience anyway, and I've got a couple of them, the disadvantage is that they're relatively fragile. In other words, you can chip the tip or chip the cutting edge a little bit easier than you might with a metal blade. That's the disadvantage that I can think of. And the other part of your question is, what's the difference, if any, between the edge produced by a whetstone versus an electric sharpener? I would say if one is experienced on the whetstone, that you're going to get a better, you can produce a better cutting edge. You have much more control, first of all, to get the angle that you want, to get the degree of polish that you want, depending on the stone that you're using. So there's much more control with a whetstone. And of course, that's going to come with practice. Now, I have also watched people, and these are a lot of these are these professional sharpeners that use a big spinning wheel to sharpen the edge of a knife, as well as other cutting tools, industrial cutting tools. And they'll have maybe 2 or 3 of these big wheels with different grits on each one. And some of these folks are really good. By the time you get to that last that wheel and put on that polishing compound, they're getting a really nice polished edge on that knife. And so in some cases, those folks, I think, might even rival, right, some of the work that folks do on a whetstone. But I think I'm from what I have experienced and certainly what I've read and folks I've talked to regarding the home electric knife sharpeners, when you compare those to what you can do on a whetstone, the whetstone is going to be superior. Again, once you develop your skill around using the rocks, right, that technology to sharpen your knives. All right, thank you. All right, next up, suggestions for creamer and cheese to replace the real stuff. I've experimented with all different brands, but I can't seem to find any that really mimic using the regular version, especially a veggie-based cheese. So yeah, I think this opens the door for me to talk a little bit about food substitutions. And I think that when we make any sort of food substitutions, whether it's pulling oil out of cooking or removing alcohol from cooking or all animal products from cooking, and we try to replicate or mimic those original results, we're going to come up with something different. That's just the way it goes when you make a change to something. Now, sometimes the results are more satisfactory than others. And part of this might certainly depend on the ingredient that's being replaced. And some of it also depends on how much we allow ourselves to enjoy the new product. Okay. And, I think part of the allowing ourselves to enjoy the substitution is very important. And because I think it's reasonable to expect that the result is going to be different. So, in other words, there's the psychology part to the consumer here, and that is we can choose to focus on what's missing, in which case what we have in front of us will never be correct, right? Or we can change that gaze or change that focus to recognize what it is that we do have, and start to embrace that new normal, right? That new texture, that new flavor, as something that is satisfying. So that's going to be what I'm going to start off with here. Now, in terms of substitutions for cheese, that's a tough one, right? Some of those aspects of the real cheese, right, dairy-based cheese that appeal to us are that silky smoothness that we get from dairy fat and all the other proteins and the complexity of that product. And then also, some of the aspects of satisfaction from dairy cheese are all of those aromatic flavor factors that, again, come from all the enzymes and proteins and fats that are in a very complex way changing and turning that milk into something very different by the time it becomes cheese. And our nose is very sensitive, right? And we pick up thousands of different aromas, and those are the things that we're picking up, right, from the dairy cheese. And when we start to bring in plant-based cheeses, they are missing that complexity. And so from a flavor perspective and also a texture perspective, it can be very, very difficult to replicate, the real thing, so to speak. And, as I have dabbled in plant-based cheeses and have critiqued them and eaten them side by side with dairy-based cheeses, the differences are always obvious. As much as I enjoy the plant-based cheeses and can continue to enjoy them, they're always, if I want to think about how different they are, I will always recognize how different they are. And so I think that's where it lies for me. So in terms of a brand of creamer and cheese, no, I don't have a particular brand to recommend. I think if you've run through some brands and they're all unsatisfactory, then it comes down to the psychology, right, of allowing ourselves to just forget about the past and enjoy what's in front of us, as difficult as that might be. All right, thank you. All right, next question. Now that I have completed the plant-based course, what opportunities are there for me to start a business? All right. So, I think, first of all, the opportunities are going to be up to your imagination, and also be up to the type of product, the type of service that you might have in mind, how appealing that is in terms of broad appeal versus specialized appeal. And how scalable the product is. Is it something that you need to produce with your own hands, in which case you're going to be limited in the volume that you can produce? Is it something that you can train others on, in which case you have some scalability, right? Some greater volume potential? Is it something that you can bring in mechanization to help you with bigger mixers and bigger ovens to help you produce more of the same quality, a satisfactory quality product? Can you ship those things globally? Or is it something that really must be consumed locally? Right? These are all going to be factors that might influence some of the opportunities that you might have. Now, as far as the knowledge set, right, and that introductory sort of skill set that comes along with having completed the plant-based course or right our professional cooking course as well as our 2 longer courses go. I think you have a good foundation, right? But it's going to be up to you to develop each of these areas of food handling so that you're an experienced cook and you can do what it is that you're doing in a way that will not only satisfy you, but also satisfy all of your potential consumers or many of your potential consumers. Of course, we're not going to satisfy everybody all the time. And but we do want to appeal to most people most of the time, right, in order to have a successful food-based business. Another thing to consider is within the context of these other aspects that I mentioned is to check out what's going on in that area of interest that you might have, see what competition is out there, see if there's a way, not if there's a way, but how you would differentiate yourself from the competition, and then put together a business plan. All right. And, if you're in the United States, or even if you're not, I guess you can go online to look up an organization called SCORE, SCORE. SCORE is made up of a group of volunteers. These are business professionals, business owners, most of them business managers in one form or another in different industries. There are food people there as well, and they act as advisors and to the small business startup or the small business owner. But the SCORE website will have some information on how to put together a business plan. And I think that's really important because a business plan will walk you through these different aspects, whether it's product development or marketing or what have you. And it kind of forces you to look yourself in the mirror, so to speak, and to address these different aspects of your idea and to decide whether it's viable or not, to really vet your idea. And, the idea is to find the challenges so that you can either back up and find a different path or to work through these challenges so you have an answer to, these speed bumps or these roadblocks that might present themselves so that you have the strongest opportunity to succeed with your new idea. All right. I hope that's helpful for you. Thank you. All right. Next up from Robert. When cutting veggies into even pieces, I find I have leftover smaller pieces that don't fit, like when cubing carrots. What do you do with this extra carrots? They won't cook at the same rate. So, Robert, when I'm cooking at home, I just put everything in the pot and I cook it. I don't worry about the irregular sized pieces. I try to get things that are generally a similar size so that they do cook evenly. But typically I'm not worrying about making beautiful cubes. But if I am, for whatever reason, then I'm going to find an outlet for the scraps. And so often that's going to go into a soup, right, or a stew or a puree of some sort. You definitely want to use that product. You never want to throw that away. And this basic approach would roll over into any commercial setting, right, any sort of a food business, a restaurant, if it's important that you present nice, clean cuts. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. If you're generating little, pieces of scrap, you definitely want to find an outlet for that. It could be a stir fry. Again, it could be a soup or a stew. Those are going to be very easy ways to incorporate those items, which means you got to put those things on your menu, right, in a way that makes sense with the other items on your menu, the theme or what have you, in order to make that sort of efficiency work. I think one of the overarching goals for all of us, whether at home or in a restaurant, is to create a no waste kitchen. And it's a challenge, right? But to really strive to eliminate waste from knife cuts that might go into the garbage can or even your compost bucket, right? The idea would be to consume that food first. That's the next challenge for all of us. All right. But I hope that answers your question, Robert. All right. Create some different ways, some different dishes to use that product. All right. Thank you. So Lorraine asks, can polenta be made in advance and reheated? Absolutely. Yes, you bet. And, polenta can be made in different viscosities depending on the amount of liquid that you add to it. The first stage, of course, is to cook that cornmeal properly, right? So it's all fully hydrated, fully gelatinized, fully cooked. And then from there, you can add more or less liquid in order to make, a stiffer end product, which can be cut into cakes and sautéed for a certain presentation. Or you can make it, much more soft like mashed potatoes for a different sort of presentation. But all those things, can be held in the fridge. You can freeze it. You can thaw it. You can reheat it. No problem at all. Okay. Be prepared to adjust the hydration, right, by perhaps adding some more liquid as needed. Your call. And then also, if you have added some flavorings or some seasoning to the polenta, always check and adjust the flavoring or seasoning before service. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, question from Alec. Excellent. Good to see you. Question is, I have 22 blueberry bushes. Awesome. And in the end, we'll have 40 plus pounds of blueberries. So is there a good way to keeping them or storing them? Is freezing the best method? Alec, freezing is most definitely the quickest and easiest method. And I think that's, what I've done most frequently. Drying, right, is another option. One of those ancient food preservation techniques. Drying is best suited to a nice hot summer day, and when you've got some of that intense heat to pull out the liquid, and even maybe a gentle breeze also to help you pull some of that liquid out away from that product too. And you want to do it, of course, quickly, right? Before mold might set in, especially at that blossom end of the blueberries, where they tend to mold. And then also, if you decide to dehydrate them, cover them with some cheesecloth or some fine mesh screen to keep the bugs away. Because as we concentrate that product, and those sugars become much more attractive to the bugs. So either way, I guess the other part of dehydrating is you can use an electric dehydrator in the house. That tends to draw electricity, which you get to pay for. If you've got 40 pounds or so of blueberries, it's going to take you a lot of time on a dehydrator. Unless you've got multiple dehydrators to use. So my tendency would be to lean toward freezing or maybe some sort of natural dehydration process. All right. I can't wait to taste some of those. Thanks. Have a great day. Next up, another question from Carol. Look at that. How do you adapt from different recipes that ask for oil? Omitting oil in muffins seems fine, but in salad dressings, it's more noticeable. What is your basic thought process as you consider an oil requiring recipe, and what are your substitution ideas? Aha. Okay, so multi-part question here. Part one. So how do you adapt? And I think, as you pointed out, Kara, it really depends, right, on what the preparation is. Some items are a little bit easier to manipulate, and other recipes not so easy. Let's see. I think, when it comes to salad dressings, we have a no oil salad dressing lesson, a task or two. And we have some example recipes that use whole food sources of fat. So avocados and nuts or seeds, for example. Perhaps you can use tofu or white beans as a base, and then supplement a little bit of fat from seeds, or avocados or nuts. So you might take a look at that task or two to get some ideas on dressings. And otherwise, more general ideas on approach to removing oil from recipes. I would say this is really a case-by-case basis. And I will say that clearly some things like simply omitting oil from sautéing or sweating is pretty easy, right? We have pretty straightforward methods of just using a liquid like stock, right, to loosen up the product in the pan. Once they've developed some color, to cool down the pan to avoid burning. But when we're talking about composed items like baked goods, then it becomes more challenging. And then some things where an oil might have made up a significant amount of that item, like a dressing, right? Then we have to get into some other, creative problem solving. So if you have particular issues or particular questions, you might just follow up through student support. You might send me a message at support@rouxbe.com, and be specific so that I can best respond to the situation. All right. Thank you. All right. Tony's up. What's the difference in terms of the end result when using conventional versus the fan oven settings? Can you name typical foods when you would use one or the other? Okay. What's the difference? Okay, so the fan setting, or the convection setting, it promotes the convection of heat, that movement of heat inside the box, inside the oven. It circulates heat. So we tend to have a hotter oven. We also have a more even heat distribution throughout the oven. So whatever you're cooking tends to brown faster and can cook faster. Sometimes it'll burn faster. Okay, so if we have the fan on for the convection effect, then very often we need to lower the temperature of the heat a little bit. Maybe it's 10, 20, 30 degrees. It depends on the oven. You'll need to test that out on your particular oven in order to get similar results to the conventional, right, or the non-fan setting, or the non-fan oven. All right. Can you name typical foods, when you would use one or the other? You can use the settings interchangeably on a lot of things. Okay. Now, when it comes to baking, I would be more careful. Okay. Because as you start to change temperatures and cooking times, there are some different effects that can come out that can result with baked goods. So exercise some caution in that area. Another thing that I'll mention is that if you use parchment paper underneath, on your sheet pan underneath something, when the fan is on, that air in there can blow up the edges of parchment paper, and it'll fold up and adhere to certain food. And, I'm thinking about sticky foods or sometimes baked items, okay, whether it's a cookie or a cake batter, and you don't want those results, right? So just be aware of some of that kind of an effect, okay? But otherwise, the overlap is very large all right, between a convection setting and a conventional setting on an oven. But you get to experiment otherwise on temperature setting and some of the time adjustments that might be necessary for your particular oven. All right, thank you. And next up, will we have access to the live events like your open office hours after the course is ended? And how long do we have access to the live events? Yes, you can access the recorded events, of course, and you'll have access to that, forever, basically, for a very long time. All right. And in fact, you can go into our archives. Go to our website, rootruby.com, scroll down to the, I think it's at the bottom now of the page. You'll see live events. Click on that, and you can go back and look at all kinds of topics that a number of us have talked about. And it ranges from Ayurveda to spices and noodles and a number of different topics that I've talked upon anyway. All right, so check out our archives. Thank you. All right, next question about vanilla. So vanilla is so expensive. Indeed it is. Do you make your own, or do you have a better way around it? So I've got a bag of vanilla beans, and yes, they were expensive. Now, in terms of vanilla, I'm guessing you're asking about vanilla, say, extract, right? Do you make your own? And lately I have. We had a big old bottle, I think about a quart of it in the fridge for a long time, and finally moved through that. But we use a lot of vanilla beans, and so we have we scrape the insides of vanilla beans, so we have the outside of the pod. And in the summertime, when I make smoothies, I'll throw that whole thing into the smoothie and just grind the whole thing up and eat the whole thing. But if we have some extras, right now they go into a small jar, and I pour vodka over them and let those steep. And we make our own vanilla extract with a little kick of vodka that goes along with it. We also have a nice jug of Rouxbe gin that I might try next as well. But so I make some of my own vanilla extract. But the bottom line is vanilla is expensive, and if you want real vanilla, unfortunately, we have to pay the price for it, whether it's a vanilla bean or whether it's a good quality extract. Or a vanilla paste, or some of these different forms that vanilla comes in. And, the alternative, of course, is to use an artificial vanilla product or to omit the vanilla altogether. All right. Thank you. Next question. And we start here. So is polenta the same as cornmeal? I read that polenta is actually the name of an Italian dish. However, it's often labeled polenta. When I buy cornmeal in bulk, does it have to do with how it's ground? Confusing. Yes. Names of foods and food products and dishes and recipes can be confusing. As people have moved about the globe, of course, we've taken our most cherished items with us, and food is among those things. And so with that has gone the vocabulary of food. And this is where some of the mixing and the confusion comes about in the food world. And so to do a little bit of untangling here, cornmeal is going to be the overarching category label. And then underneath cornmeal, we find these different products. And so we have grits, right? Or we have polenta. There's different grinds, fine, medium, and coarse. So polenta, on one hand, in terms of your bulk section purchase, polenta is a type of cornmeal, right? At the same time, polenta does refer to a preparation from the Italian cookery tradition. In that context, polenta, is a dish that's made from other grains as well. And so it's not restricted to corn, but it could be made from other grains as well. But certainly in a North American or in the U.S. context, when we say polenta, we're usually thinking about that Italian preparation. And in order to make it, we're gonna reach for some sort of a cornmeal that's often labeled as polenta from our grocery store or our vendor if we're in a restaurant setting. I hope that that makes sense. Yeah, I think that answers. I think that answers your questions, Carol. Keep in mind, again, that the coarseness of the grind varies, and it's going to be up to you to decide what you like to use. You can go to the grocery store, the bulk section, and buy what's called polenta, right, cornmeal, that's of a certain grind coarseness. Take that home and make polenta. But you can also buy a more coarse ground cornmeal and cook it in the same way and make polenta. The texture will be a little bit different. The mouthfeel will be a little bit different, but you can call them both polenta. So keep that in mind as well. That's just part of the nuances of cooking, some of the beauty, right, of these food discussions. And thank you for bringing this up today. All right, next question. Hello. In pursuing the dream of stepping into food operations world, once awarded with the professional cook certificate, what would be the best way to follow this path? Great question. So this is going to have some overlap to a previous question I answered here today. But the first one is, if your goal is to start a restaurant or a cafe, right? Some place where you would welcome guests into your dining room. Then I first recommend very strongly that you go out and work for somebody else so that you can learn the idiosyncrasies of the restaurant world. There are so many small sort of nuanced aspects of preparing food, preparing it efficiently, storing it safely, interacting with vendors, managing different aspects of the business, including employees, that it's best to learn these while you're working for somebody else. Part of the challenge of our industry, our food business, is that our inventory is perishable. So unlike, say, a shoe store, right? You can go on vacation for a month and you come back and your inventory is still fine. But you can't ignore your food inventory for even a couple of days sometimes, depending on the ingredient. Otherwise, it goes south and we lose money if it spoils. And so, these sorts of things, I think, are best learned while we're working for somebody else. The aspects of human resource management, right, dealing with employees, is also very nuanced because we have the blessing to work with, in some ways, a unique workforce in the restaurant industry. We're not necessarily getting a consistent profile of person like you might find in a law firm, for example. We're getting all kinds of people from all different walks of life, different life experiences, and it becomes important for us to meet each of those people where they are and to work with them in their in unique ways. And that aspect of the industry makes it also complicated, right? And many of these people are itinerant workers in a way. They might come and work for you for a couple of months, maybe 6 months, and then they're off to the next restaurant or maybe some other industry altogether, in which case the turnover, the employee turnover in the industry is relatively high. And so, that's another thing that makes this industry a difficult one to work with as an owner. And so it's best to, I think, learn, these different facets of the business, again, while working for somebody else. So that's going to be really, I think, my overarching recommendation here, as you wrap up your either Pro Cook or Pro Plant certificate course, and you move on into the professional food world. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, if your goal is to create your own small-scale business or maybe your own product, then definitely move down the path of creating a business plan in order to vet your idea and to see just how viable it is as is. Okay, thank you. All right, Maxwell. Do you suggest buying a good chef's knife when first starting? This is a great question. I think a really fair question to ask. I'll first of all say it's not necessary to go out and spend, let's just say a couple $100 on a knife. Okay. And a couple $100 is kind of midpoint in my world between really good knives and more average knives. So we'll kind of use that as a midpoint here. I think if money is no object, right, or if otherwise somebody is sponsoring the knife purchase for you, then you might go ahead and opt for something that's custom made or something really interesting, great quality, comes with a high price tag. But if I'm opening up my own wallet, I would recommend as a starting point the Victorinox brand. That's the Swiss Army knife people, Victorinox. Brand kitchen knives, and they've got chef's knives, 8-inch, 10-inch, whatever your preferred size is. They are amazingly inexpensive, $40 or so for a knife. The metal is not particularly hard, which means it's easy to sharpen, it's easy to maintain, and you can bang around on them, and you don't feel bad. About a little scratch here or a nick there. You can practice developing your skills on a whetstone if that interests you, right before you drop down $200 or $300 on something more expensive. I think that's also a very sound way to start. But I would direct you toward Victorinox as a good value. In fact, a few years ago, they were rated the top choice by Consumer Reports magazine, which I like. Thank you for the question. All right, next up. I have a problem maintaining constant temperature in my oven during a cooking process, which necessitates the oven to be opened for whatever reason, i.e. temperature fluctuations in a drop of up to 40 degrees C. So how do I get around this? So a couple of things come to mind, as you present this scenario. And number one is, if you're opening the oven because you need to, right? Because you're rotating the sheet pan or you're checking the doneness or the temperature on a product, we can't avoid that. The object in that case would be to do it as quickly as you can, close that door and try to maintain as much heat as you can, allow that oven to recover. Okay. When we set an oven at a temperature, like 350 degrees, the way the thermostat works is it's always up above or below that temperature. All right. So, the we set the dial at 350. It warms up, and then it'll kick off, and then the temperature will drop a little bit. All right, and then the thermostat kicks in. It'll kick in the heat again. It goes up above that 350 benchmark, and then turns off, and then cools down again. It repeats that cycle. So there's always a little bit of fluctuation in the oven. Now, if you're experiencing 40 degrees C, sort of a fluctuation, that's a lot. I would recommend two things here to try to solve that problem to the best you can. One is to get a secondary oven thermometer. Place that in your oven just to check, and perhaps that's what you've done to figure this out. And probably all of us would benefit from this. Just get an oven thermometer, put that in your oven, and check that temp against the dial setting on your oven to see if there's any difference. Now, if there is a significant difference that persists, then it's time to call in a technician to recalibrate your oven. And that's the answer. That's what we do in restaurants. We don't do that at home very often, certainly not often enough, I think, because if you're experiencing such a big fluctuation, it really needs to be addressed by a professional technician. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Carol. Are cream of wheat, cream of rice considered processed? Well, let me respond to that in a couple of ways. One is to think about the word processed, and one is to think about the word refined. Okay, so an unprocessed food would be a whole food. Okay, so the whole wheat berry or the whole grain of rice would be unprocessed. So cream of wheat or cream of rice is processed, right? It's ground in some fashion to something less than its whole grain. It's not necessarily a bad thing if everything is left intact, right? All the bran and all that healthful goodness. The cream of wheat and cream of rice that comes to my mind has been stripped of the bran. It tends to be white in color, in which case it's been refined. So it's no longer a whole food. So think about that within this bigger discussion of being something being processed versus being refined, or a little bit of both. Okay, so foods that start out whole and retain all of their whole goodness once they're cut up, right, can be still enjoyed in a processed state, but with all that goodness. Goodness means fiber, number one, and the accompanying micronutrients that come along with that complexity of the whole food. All right, thank you. Next up from Sarah. Which kind of mortar do you recommend, and how can we use it? And Sarah, I have, I don't know, probably 10 or so mortar and pestle sets in the kitchen, and I use about half of them frequently and the others less frequently. The ones that and they range in material from marble, ceramic, wood, brass, stainless steel, and then stone. The one that I use most often is stone. It's large, probably this big around. It's about this high. I picked it up a long time ago at a Vietnamese grocery store, and I do most of my work in that mortar. I also have a small marble one that I use for just maybe 5 or 6 peppercorns that are going into something. But I have these large mortars, a couple of them on different counters locations, so that I don't have to move them around. They're always there at the prep spaces. And I use them for everything. So for example, I don't use an electric spice grinder. All of the spices are ground with a mortar and pestle. I feel that the aroma and the flavor is generally better. And certainly other things like curry pastes are going to be, just fantastic if you do it by hand in that fashion. So my recommendation is find something that's big enough to accommodate the foods that you intend to prep with the mortar and pestle. And you might even end up with more than one. And I'll give you another example of the larger ones that I use. One is the bowl is cut deeper than the other. So that's the one that I'm going to use for Thai curry paste, for example. And then the shallower one I use for crushing spices or cocoa nibs, things that are smaller in volume and just don't need that larger bowl. All right, so a couple of strategies that you might consider. Thanks. All right, next question. What are your thoughts on the future of consumer demand for plant-based meal options? Wow, okay. I suspect that, first of all, they're here to stay and probably going to be increasing, if the other food trends are any indication. Other food trends meaning grocery store sales, restaurant sales, shift in menus at restaurants toward more plant-based offerings. In terms of consumers' meal replacement options are concerned, so these ready-made meals or meal kits, I think more people are interested, right, in the healthful aspects of a plant-based lifestyle or a plant-strong lifestyle, right? This is maybe I'll differentiate those two terms. For me and for us at Rouxbe, plant-based. If I'm going to tell people that I am plant-based, that means I am plant-based. I don't eat anything that's animal-based. There are a lot of folks out there that are significantly plant-based, but they might eat some occasional animal-based foods, right? In which case there is a term that's become popular of late called plant-strong, right? I'm on a plant-strong diet, or I lead a plant-strong lifestyle. But there's more and more people out there that are moving in that direction I think for all the right reasons. And so these sort of plant-based meal options will become more popular. All right, but take a look at food trends. Do a Google search, and there are some big companies that every year, put out the latest data on what consumers are doing in the spaces of restaurants and grocery stores and takeout food and delivery food. So you can get a pretty good idea of where the trend is heading. All right, thank you. Next up, can you explain the steps you would use to incorporate silken tofu into spaghetti sauce? When do you choose firm, extra firm, or regular silken tofu? Is there much difference among the silken? I only see a difference in firmness among non-silken. Okay. So there is firmness differences in both categories, silken as well as non-silken, and it has to do with water content. And in terms of what you want to choose, it's totally up to you. I mean, it's going to be the aesthetic experience is totally going to be up to you. How do you incorporate that into a spaghetti sauce? I would put it in a blender if I want it to be smooth, and incorporate it in with whatever base I'm making, whether it's a white sauce or a tomato-based sauce or something else. If you wanted, some chunks of tofu, then you can break it up with your fingers, or you can slice it with a knife, depending on what sort of a look or an aesthetic sort of a finished product you want. So yeah, this is going to be totally up to you. But I think any of those products that you've mentioned, silken, non-silken, various firmnesses, can all work in a pasta sauce. Okay, thank you. Is there a way to connect with other students enrolled in the program? It'd be nice for us all to connect. Yeah, good question, Christine. I think, first of all, you might send that question into our student support team. And, we could probably have some sort of discussion in that context. Okay. And they've got probably better ideas than I have off the top of my head on how that might be done. All right, so support at Rouxbe.com. Thanks. And Shirley asks, are we going to be able to access all the recipes from the activities from each lesson after the course is complete, or should we print each one? So you'll be able to read through the tasks. Let's see. Patrick, will the printing function still be up? Can you tell me that? I'll get back to your question here, Shirley, in just a moment. Okay. So the reply I got, Shirley, is that you will be able to access everything. No need to print your recipes at this point. You'll be able to access them after graduation as well. Okay. Thank you. All right. Joshua asks how to make Salona vegetables. So I'm guessing this is Salona, or sometimes called Saluna preparations, Middle Eastern preparations. These are, generally simmered dishes, and ingredients and flavor profiles vary considerably, but they've got a variety of vegetables with spices, and they're going to be simmered to finish. So it's a gravy-like liquid or a sauce, right, is developed. More specifically on how you might make a particular, style or recipe, you might look online, and there's certainly a lot of information on the category of saluna, or these simmered Middle Eastern dishes for you to look at, whether you want something that profiles salted lemon, right, or some other flavor profile that you might like. All right, thank you. All right, so fiber is my favorite F word. Ha ha ha. Yes. My favorite 4-letter F word is food, which is such a controversial topic. I love discussing aspects of food and food culture, which can push the buttons of a lot of people. But we'll approach that on a different time here. So thanks for explaining everything with so much detail. Hey, you're welcome, Lorena. I appreciate all your questions and your engagement, your involvement in the courses here. I really appreciate it. Thank you. From Helen. Hello. 2 questions. 2 questions, please, and apologies if they have been asked before. How to decide the right temperature for Le Creuset and cast iron pans. How could you please recommend best knives for vegan cooking, size, shape, material? Okay, so we got a couple of wide open questions here. So I think on question number 1, what you're getting at is within the context of the so-called mercury ball test, right? The water ball test that we tend to emphasize with stainless steel pans. And my response here is that as we work with pans of other materials, the finish or the porosity of the surface is a little bit different than stainless steel, i.e. they tend to be more porous. So the bead of water acts or reacts differently. So it becomes important to feel the heat, okay? And when I say feel the heat, I mean literally put your hands over the pan as it's heating up, get your face over the pan, and start to really embody the experience of cooking. And you will start to understand, in conjunction with adding food to the pan, what the best temperatures are. We need to use our hearing to listen to our food. We have to use our eyes to look for caramelization, our nose for the aromas. Of course, we taste along the way, we touch, right? So it's full sensory engagement, right? That's really the beauty of cooking. And you may well be working at a lower temperature point, but there's certainly going to, or maybe not, right? Depends on what you're preparing. But you'll need to just kind of find your zone, right? Your temperature zone for the optimal cooking for most items, and then adjust from there. Sometimes it's cooler, right? If you're cooking shallots and garlic, maybe it's hotter if you're preparing something else. But it's really fundamentally the same as stainless steel cookware or any other cookware, okay? Because of the density and the way different materials hold on to heat, we have to adjust heat up or down, or give the pan a shorter or longer period of time to heat up. Copper heats up very quickly. Cast iron takes a little bit longer, right, for example. And so all of this just requires our engagement as cooks to make the best choices, okay? And then number 2, could you please recommend best knives for vegan cooking? So just cooking in general, okay? I'm going to go back to, well, it kind of depends on your budget, okay? And also what sorts of ingredients you might be cooking. In other words, softer things or harder things like winter squash that have a really hard shell on them. If it's sort of all of the above, you might, first of all, start out with a chef's knife, they tend to be middle weight, fairly tough, fairly hardy, especially toward the heel of the knife where it gets to be more robust. You can crack through some of the tougher winter vegetables, Hubbard squash, for example, without damaging the knife. Here, for that sort of heavy work, you might consider what we call a European style chef's knife, which tends to be a little bit thicker in its blade width, and therefore hardier to stand up against some of these harder items. Also in vogue today are what we might call Japanese style chef's knives, which tend to be thinner and lighter weight. They are fantastic at working through lighter weight vegetables, thinner cutting. But when it comes to hard items, they can also chip along the cutting edge. So you have to be careful. And so depends on, what sort of, what's comfortable for you in your hand. It's always a good idea to get your hand on a couple, 3 knives to see what's comfortable for you, okay, and actually use it. Some people say that the Japanese style chef knife is too light in their hand and not comfortable. They want more weight. While others, right, say that a European style chef's knife is heavy and cumbersome, and they prefer the lighter weight of a more delicate blade. So there's a lot of variation from individual to individual, and therefore important for you to try it out. Now, beyond the chef's knife, there are different styles of knives, right? So, a santoku, right? It's got a kind of a sloped top edge of the blade and mostly flat on the bottom, maybe a slight curve to it, is very common these days, very popular. You give that a try. The way it rocks is different than a chef's knife. And so it feels different when you're doing your work. And so, it's going to be up to you. It's a very personal decision. So you might buy a couple of 3 less expensive knives. And I will, again, throw out the name Victorinox to consider. It's not the only brand, of course, but it's one that I think is a good value. They provide some different styles of knives at an entry price point. they present a good value, and you can just kind of see what you like before you might invest in a more expensive knife or two. All right, thank you. What advice can you give for starting a plant-based business? I completed the course and I would love to start a business. Not sure what sort of options are and how to go about it. Okay, so I will respond relatively quickly since I've talked about this in response to those two previous questions, Renee. But number one, you want a business plan. Business plan, I think, is indispensable. The failure rate of small business startup, especially in the food business, is very high, approaching 80%. Within the first, I think it's 4 years or so. And so it's going to be up to you to do your due diligence. And a business plan will force you to do that, in a sense, if you follow through diligently, in that plan. And then otherwise, get out and work for people. See what is going on in that area of the industry that you're interested in. Buy those products, eat at those restaurants, critique those products, critique those restaurants, and get to know that space as well as you can, and then give it a try. You start out on a small scale. You might test your product at a farmer's market, for example, or you might test out a catering service, just via an informal word of mouth basis on a small scale. Create a website. I think in this day and age, a website is indispensable. Then it's important to maintain the website. There's nothing more irritating for a consumer to happen upon a website that hasn't been updated in 2 or 3 years. And so all of these sorts of things, I think, come together as starting points for a small business idea. All right, thank you. Next up is Seitan, a processed food. How do you make use of tempeh? Please give examples of using each. So is Seitan a processed food? So Seitan is wheat gluten, right? So it's pulling that particular protein, those proteins out of wheat flour, and then isolating it, and then using that to make something that has a very tough, chewy, sort of a meat-like texture for some people. So again, going back to what we think of as processed versus whole food. Whole food is the wheat berry. Anything beyond that, once we've cut it or ground it, is going to be processed. And then Seitan isolates a component of the wheat. So it's definitely a processed food. Okay. How do you make use of tempeh? So tempeh is traditionally a fermented soybean product. There are other variations today that use other beans, other ingredients as well. Very commonly, it is simmered in order to soften it, and then flavoring can be added at that stage. And then you can grill it or finish it via sautéing, a dry heat method to apply some color to it. They can pieces of tempeh can be incorporated into a curry, into a stew to add texture. Not to mention the nutritional component brought in by tempeh, which is again based on legumes. We see some other varieties too, but so a good source of protein, or those amino acids that contribute to protein as our body builds that protein. So those are a couple of ideas. I've also enjoyed it grilled with a peanut sauce, as an appetizer. So you might take a look online for some other ideas and give it a try. All right, thank you. All right, so next up from Laura. Loving your suggested Ayurvedic cookbook and eagerly ordered some Hing, okay, for those I cook for who are sensitive to garlic and onions. Great. Then I read warnings about it. Should I worry about using it? Offhand, I'm not recalling what the warnings are. Maybe it's a contamination along the way, but two things come to mind whenever I hear about warnings about food items, ingredients. Number one, Hing isn't used in great quantity, right? We're using a pinch here, maybe a pinch there. And we're probably not, it depends on your cooking style, I suppose. We may not be using it every day, right? It could be used once a week by some people or more or less. So at that rate, it may not be a concern. If it still is a concern, and this is true of, arsenic concerns in brown rice as well, I would say, further cut it back or even eliminate it from your diet, right? I think either reduce it, right, or omit it from the diet. Those would be the answers. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Lorena. I'm making vegetable stock from frozen vegetable scraps. Should I add salt or not? Okay. So from the professional perspective, when we make stock, really any stock, we don't add salt. Okay, and the basic premise is that stock is going to be used in something else. Often we don't necessarily know what it is going to be used in. It could be used 3 or 4 days from now in something I haven't thought about yet. The stock will be reduced, and any salt in there may be further concentrated. It also gives me more control if I salt my food separately. And so the general sort of professional approach and my personal approach is not to salt my stock. The argument on the other side could easily be, if I'm making this stock for this application and I know where it's going, how about if I salt it now? That's fine. That's totally up to you. Okay. Thank you. All right. Next up, having trouble getting good fresh produce here in New York. Very hard to keep up with the exercises. What can I do? There are certainly mail order sources for produce, if that's an option that you're willing to consider. Pardon me? Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, Chef's Garden. Take a look at that online. Chef's Garden. They are one popular source for home delivery of some very nice quality produce. And, otherwise, I think the option would be to just kind of slow down your pace in the course in order to match sort of the pace of your shopping or the food deliveries. Okay, thanks. And from Paul, is there a difference in flavor, consistency, or nutrients as well other factors between organic eggs I buy at the farmer's market for $5 a dozen or the 49 cents a dozen eggs I buy at your local chain? Chain grocery store. Okay. Is there a difference in flavor, consistency, or nutrients, okay, between certified organic and non-eggs? All right. So flavor and consistency. So flavor is going to be subjective a lot of times. So certified organic is going to refer to, in a big way, the feed given to the chicken, as well as to some extent the type of care the chickens have received. And how that translates to flavor, a lot of times it doesn't. That's going to be, I think, most of the time a subjective call. And so you might just line up a couple of maybe different egg preparations, one from organic certified, one from conventional eggs, and see if you pick up a difference. The flavoring that comes through eggs can be affected by the feed as well. And so that very often has nothing to do with the eggs being certified organic or not. Consistency, I mean, things like, I'll say color, right? The egg yolk color is affected by the type of feed more than anything else. And so again, that's not dependent upon the eggs being certified organic necessarily. And then, nutrients, generally speaking, eggs fall into a fairly narrow nutrient profile. In other words, they're pretty consistent. We do see some difference in nutrients when chickens are fed a diet that's particularly concentrated in certain nutrients. And then those will carry through to the eggs. And, sometimes those cartons are labeled as such, omega-3 rich eggs, for example. And again, that's not necessarily tied to whether they're certified organic or not. Okay. So, you'll need to take a look at these side by side and weigh how important these different factors are, that I mentioned. Okay. And then weigh that against the price tag, and then, go from there. I think, overall, when it comes to certified organic foods, one of the advantages is that there's arguably less chemical input, which is good for environmental quality. All right, so water quality, soil quality, even air quality is affected. When it comes to the health and the welfare of farm workers, there can be a difference as well, with either fewer chemicals or sometimes less harsh chemicals being used in a context where foods are produced organically, certified organic. So it's not depending on what's important to you, right? It can be more than a flavor, consistency, or nutrient factor that may come to the surface as being important for you. But give those things a thought. All right, thank you. When I get garlic, it usually has a green sprout in it. I'm not sure if that means it's going bad. And how do you tell if garlic is good to eat ripe, if you will, okay, at the grocery store? Garlic that's starting to sprout, Alec, just means that it's been sitting around a while. And, it wants to push up a new shoot. And it's certainly good to eat. There are definitely some changes taking place, some enzymatic changes taking place. Honestly, I haven't slowed down long enough to do any sort of a comparison in flavor. I find the garlic that it doesn't bother me, and I just go forth with cooking it. So it's certainly not going bad. If anything, plant it, and you can just start to grow garlic in your garden, right? Next to your blueberries. And so the second part of your question, how do you tell if garlic is, good to eat when it's at the grocery store? I take a look at, first of all, the color. Garlic, most of the garlic we get at the grocery store, among all the varieties, right, tends to have a white skin, in which case the garlic should be white. As it gets old and if it's starting to spoil or rot or mold under the skin, we can often see some of that dark color come through. And so you'll see some dark spots. in which case give it a little pinch. And garlic, a head of garlic should be firm all the way through. And if you have soft spots, then that's an indication that it's getting old. It's not necessarily spoiled or moldy. It could just be dehydrated and becoming a little bit spongy or soft in consistency. Okay, so give it the visual test, right? Are there dark spots that really shouldn't be there? And then give it the pinch test to see if it's firm or getting a little bit spongy, and then move on from there. All right, thanks. Next question. What are the challenges in using egg substitutes? How about vegan butter? All right. Let's see. So, the challenge is that eggs are a pretty magical food. They do so many different things in that one package that when we try to make a substitution, either that product in the carton doesn't fulfill all of those things that a real egg does, or we have to use 2 or 3 or 4 different ingredients to mimic the effects of the real egg. So those are the challenges of using egg substitutes. Okay, eggs really are unique. They're very interesting in that sense. And how about vegan butter? Let's see. Depends on what you're making, but flavor and aroma can vary quite a bit. Okay, butter has a certain aroma and flavor to it that we associate characteristically with certain preparations. Like a croissant. And if we use a vegan butter to make a croissant, sometimes while it's pretty darn good, it just doesn't quite have that butteriness, right, of butter. And so, as I was talking about earlier in today's program, we can choose to focus on what we have in front of us and just totally enjoy that. But if you are making a comparison, then one of the challenges is to truly replicate what it is that you're replacing. But again, having said that, it is reasonable to expect a difference in texture, aroma, the visual look, those sorts of things. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. All right, but certainly it depends on the application. Because the effects or the characteristics of these ingredients will come out in different ways. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, my family has not fully transitioned to whole food plant-based as yet. My question is, can I prepare a main course, meat and vegetable, in the same pan with the same whole food plant-based sauce, and have it still be okay for my whole food plant-based family members? I'll answer this in 2 ways. One is that technically, right, once you've introduced a meat or an animal product in some way to the pot, then the pot and its contents are no longer whole food plant-based. Now, once we get to the table and you want to, kind of pick just the vegetables out of there and enjoy the gravy or the broth with that, and be comfortable with that being a plant-based meal, that's totally up to you. I'm certainly not going to make any judgments. Some people would object to that, but others would be okay with that. So that's, arguably it's not plant-based, maybe vegetarian. But again, I'll let you make that call and based on your comfort level. All right, thank you. Personal question. Okay. Do you have any favorite quick and easy meals? For example, a couple ideas that you prepare over and over and it become a favorite in your home. Okay, so that's not the kind of personal question I was anticipating. This is much easier to answer, perhaps. Or maybe it's more difficult to answer. I'm not sure. Do I have any favorite quick and easy meals? Well, it's not an easy question. Let me give me a few more seconds to think about this. I think in terms of maybe some different preparations that constitute a meal, right? One would be some sort of a stir fry, and we usually have some things in the fridge or in the pantry that can take the flavor profile toward Southeast Asia or into Mexico or maybe into India or South Asia. Spices, and if I'm not making my own curry paste, we've got 3 tubs of curry paste in the fridge right now. I've got 3 or 4 or 5 dried chili varieties in the pantry, achiote and paste and different ingredients, right, that allow me to pretty quickly grab some different things and put them together with the same vegetables, perhaps, right, to make a stir fry that goes in one direction or another in terms of a regional flavoring. Okay, so stir fry, right, with options of spices and things. Hummus or a hummus-inspired bean dip. One thing that we tend to have going on around here is some sort of a legume soaking. And that sort of thing is very quickly cooked on the stovetop, oftentimes in a pressure cooker. And then we can spin that, add some tahini. Sometimes I'm putting a bunch of other stuff into it too. I mean, I'll put in Indian pickles and puree it, put in some cumin and coriander, take it in one direction. There's salted lemon, orange zest, parsley, different ingredients. And that becomes a pretty quick and easy component on the table. And then, there's oftentimes rice. We've got, 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of rice at a time, brown, white, of different types, and other grains as well, quinoa, for example. And so those we can cook up just grains fairly quickly. If they're harder grains like a wheat berry or oat groats, then those will be soaking. And these things can soak for days. So don't feel that gosh, if I soak it overnight like the recipe says, I have to use it tomorrow. No, you can use it 2 or 3 or 4 days from now. You might change the water once or twice in between just to keep it fresh, but you can soak beans and grains for days. And if you want to slow down any sort of funk that might grow, put it in the fridge and let it soak, and that'll buy you some more time. Otherwise, corn tortillas. We're always making tortillas multiple times a week, and I'm making them, or someone's making them, or son is making them, and they're very quick to make. We always have masa harina on hand, and incorporate that with some really hot water. Let that hydrate. Portion it out into your balls. Press it. Put it on a hot skillet, and then over a live fire to puff them up. And really, really quickly, you got some beautiful aroma and the best freshly made flatbreads right in front of you to enjoy with the stir fry and the hummus and I don't know, maybe some other things too. But that's just a quick idea, right? So this all comes back to this idea of batch cooking, right? Which is the premise of efficient cooking at home and at restaurants too, in a lot of cases. But the idea that you've got these different staple items, condiments, and other components of your cookery plan that you can then sort of put together like puzzle pieces to make a picture of an Indian meal, or a picture of a Mexican meal, or a picture of a Thai meal. right, from these different puzzle pieces. So that's the efficiency, right, of having a well-stocked pantry, and always having in the back of your mind this sort of conveyor belt process of soaking beans and soaking grains, and then the timing of when to cook them, and making sure you're eating up all the leftovers before you cook off the next new batch of items. And then you develop some skill around making tortillas, right? Or maybe it's chapatis, which are it's essentially a flour tortilla, but it's an Indian flour, a wheat flour flatbread. And so, these sort of things become very quick and routine for you. Okay, not to mention delicious and good for you as well. All right, so that's my short answer. Thank you for asking that personal question. Next up, regarding Le Creuset, what's the best method to help a tired old pan come back to life? So, if the question here is that the surface has been scrubbed off and really needs to be refreshened through a new layer of oil being baked on, I think we move through those steps of seasoning the pan. And as I mentioned earlier, you can look up nice steps towards seasoning an iron pan on Serious Eats food blog. You can take a look at Serious Eats online, or send me a message at support@rouxbe.com, and I'll forward the direct link to you. Thank you. Can you recommend a brand of sun-dried tomato without oil? I've been using the jar with oil and rinsing and draining off the oil. Yes. So the sun-dried tomatoes without oil that I use are simply dried tomatoes, and you can buy them at places like Trader Joe's. Probably other grocery stores have them as well. If you want to buy something online, go to a place. There's multiple places, but one place that comes to mind is called nuts.com. And among other things, they sell sun-dried tomatoes. They're just dried sun-dried tomatoes. Then you can rehydrate them or use them however you want to. All right, thank you. Recently, I was able to make only about 1 quart of vegetable stock in my 4.5 quart pot. So for this process to be practical, I need a larger pot. If the pot is too large, it will hang way out over the burner. What size stock pot would you recommend? Well, I would say that, I'm trying to think what size stock pot I have upstairs. It's probably a couple of gallons, which is more like 8 quarts. And that gets us through, most all of our stock needs here at home. Now, we have a couple of pots that size, actually, I guess more than a couple, but I'm usually using 1 pot to make stock, and I think it's about 8 quarts. So that's a suggestion for you to get, probably more like 3 quarts or so, upwards of a gallon, depending on how intense the stock is. It just depends on how you're going to use the stock. Okay, thank you. All right, next up. What's the best truffle oil for asparagus risotto, black or wild? Gosh, I can go either way, and I think really it's personal preference, right? Give it a try, or have both of them on hand, and see what you like. Provided you like truffle oil, right? If you're not sure, then just buy one of them. Truffle oil is not for everybody, right? It could be very heady, just very, very strong. And so certainly a little bit goes a long way. All right. But either one is good. All right. Thank you. All right. So next one from Gerald. I know you prefer stainless steel fry pans, but do you have a preferred size, or does it depend on how many you're eating? I was wondering if it's better to have plenty of room or just enough. Yeah, stainless also, first of all, say that stainless steel is not a requirement. Um, I think here at home, I'm using cast iron quite a bit. I use a nonstick pan for some applications. Um, yeah, so stainless steel is fine, but it's not necessarily the one you got to have. In terms of size, yeah, it certainly depends on how many people are coming to dinner or how much food you would normally cook. Yeah, and so your question regarding is it better to have plenty of room or just enough? So it depends on what you're cooking. All right, I'll give you a couple of examples. So if I'm simmering something, and I probably want to have the pan full. Okay. Otherwise, liquids tend to reduce too rapidly. And that's not always what I want. All right. Cooking can occur unevenly, and then I have to adjust the balance of the sauce depending on what I'm adding, water or stock. And either way, it can get out of balance. And so, having just the right size pan is a good thing for certain preparations. If I am, let's say, well, I guess, yeah, similar response here, but if I'm pan frying something and I've got a lot of it to make, then I certainly don't want to overcrowd the pan, right? One of the principles of sautéing and pan frying is to avoid overcrowding the pan, because it drops the temperature of the pan and it promotes sweating of the product. And so, in that case, you want to have a pan that's large enough to accommodate the volume of food that you're cooking. So, it might behoove you to have maybe a couple of different sizes of pans on hand, but they don't have to be stainless steel. All right, thank you. Next up, from Guess Who? Carol. All right. I limit my salt intake, but when a recipe calls for salt, what type do you recommend? And should we be concerned about having enough iodine? I've been using iodized salt. So, in terms of recommended salt, I would almost say anything is fine. I mean, here at home, we've got two kinds of salt by the stovetop. One is kosher salt. One is Himalayan pink salt. I don't know why I choose one or the other, but they're both there. And then in the cupboard, just one step away, we've got another 3 or 4 different kinds of salts: red and pink and black. And so I think any of those can be fine. Keep in mind that certainly if you're baking, you might want to stick with one kind of salt, because the density of these salts differs. And so maybe if you're weighing the salt, not a big deal. But if you're using a measuring spoon, they can be very, very different in volume. So therefore in saltiness in the end. Now, as far as concern for iodine goes, this is going to be more of a physician, right? Or maybe a dietitian sort of a question rather than a chef question. If you have any concerns about iodine, then certainly use iodized salt, or if there's some other sources of iodine that you can reach for, whether it's a seagrass or something else in your diet, then consider that. But otherwise, consult your local physician. All right, thank you. If I don't have a mandolin, does shaving fennel bulb with a knife work just as well? What can I use the top part of the fennel for? Do you rinse it before storing it? It seems too fragile. So yeah, you bet. I mean, if your knife work is controlled and you can get some nice thin shavings off the bulb, you bet. I mean, after all, before the mandolin was built, that's what we were all doing, right? Was just using our knife to get some shavings off of the fennel bulbs. That's perfect. The top part of the fennel bulb, I mean, it's a vegetable, and so you can incorporate that depending on how big or small you want to cut it into stir fries or into soups and stews, into fried rice, right? If you cut it pretty fine. So those are some different ways that you might use it. I like the licoricey flavor, and I snack on it sometimes. It can go if you cut it down. It's fibrous, so if you cut it down into small pieces, you can then drop that into your smoothie and blend it up as well. Do you rinse before storing? Certainly, if you want to rinse it before storing, that's not a requirement. I think it can go. Your rinsing can occur before or after storage. It is fragile. Certainly, those little fronds that come off are very fragile. Those tend to decay the fastest, but the thicker stalk or the stem is still good. So even if the fronds break down, you can just trim those off and use the parts that are still good. All right, but yeah, definitely strive for the zero waste kitchen by utilizing all of those components. Thank you. Next up, how do you slow down the course? I'm having trouble shopping and getting good ingredients. Yes, that's a good point. I mean, after all, 90 days or 6 months, there's no slowing down 90 days, right? The option there would be to purchase an extension if you needed more time. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, you'll need to, based upon your unique situation, look for the best solutions on how to procure the produce. Again, whether it's by a mail order source or if you have access to any local markets or what have you. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Next up, do people take this online course just for learning and not for certification? And if so, would they have access to the material even after the course ended? After you finish our courses, especially the longer courses, you'll have some acknowledgement, some sort of acknowledgement that you've completed the course. And what you want to do with it is totally up to you, right? Most of our students are home cooks. We have a percentage of folks that have some sort of a professional aspiration, whether it's working in a restaurant or whether it's starting a small-scale home-based business or designing a food product that they can market. In which case they want to use their certificate as some sort of a bona fide to show the world what they have done. And then, otherwise, will you have access to the material? Yes, you'll have access to the material, once you complete the course. What you don't have access to are the assessments and the live feedback from the instructors in the course. You can always come to a live event like this and ask a question, however. Okay, thank you. Next up, what are viable substitutes for wheat flour in baking recipes? Is it cup for cup substitution? Do you need to add any additional components when making flour substitutions? Was making carrot cupcake recipe in course, did not have any whole wheat flour. Okay, so this is an interesting question. So viable substitutes for wheat flour in baking. So baking can get challenging. Okay, it depends on what you're baking. So if you're baking an artisanal loaf of bread, things can get very nuanced and very particular and very complicated. And I don't have the answer for that right here. If you're baking, let's say, a loaf of quick bread, banana bread, zucchini bread, and you want to make some substitutions, or if you're making a batch of cookies and you want to make substitutions, it gets a lot easier. Okay. So a substitute for wheat flour. So I'm guessing that we want to, that doesn't matter. We're going to avoid wheat, in which case, remember that the reason that wheat flour works so well in most baking applications is it's gluten, right? And gluten is what lends the structure to the finished product. And so it makes breads nice and chewy, or it allows breads to rise and to hold that form once they're baked and cooled, for example. So in the absence of wheat flour, most other ingredients don't have gluten. So we need to then find ways to replicate that structure. And oftentimes that's done with the addition of some sort of a gum, like xanthan gum. Sometimes, or usually it's done by blending multiple grains or multiple ingredients as well. And so it could be multiple grains. Sometimes it's a bean flour. Sometimes it's a tapioca flour. And these things come together because they're all unique in their textural properties, but they all come together in a way that can come close to mimicking the gluten in the wheat flour. So my recommendation, first of all, if you want a quick fix, is to reach for a commercial gluten-free flour blend. And Bob's Red Mill has some options for you. So you check out the website or look for their products at the store and see what that does for you. In our Rouxbe courses, or at Rouxbe, we do have one example of a gluten-free flour blend that incorporates 3 or 4 different flours. You can check that out and see if you like the results, right? It just depends on what you're doing and what you're expecting in the way of the finished product. Is it a cup-for-cup substitution? Generally, it is. When we bake something, we're often working with a formula. It's a recipe that has been tested, and the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients are kind of set in a ratio that works together. So when we pull out 1 cup of flour, this type of flour, you want to substitute it with 1 cup of a different sort of flour. So generally it's a cup for cup substitution, okay, in order to maintain the wet to dry ratio that works. But again, depending on what ingredients you bring in, textures become sticky and we need to make other adjustments in the formula. So things can really become complicated if you're trying to design something yourself from the ground up. So do you need to add additional components? So I answer that. Oftentimes, yes, or usually the answer is yes. Was making carrot cupcakes, do not have any whole wheat flour. So yeah, so if if you want to, if you don't have whole wheat flour, you can use other wheat flour. That is also an option. So if gluten is not the issue, you can always bring in another wheat flour and use that. Again, to some degree, it'll depend upon what you're making and the desired structure in the end product, because different types of wheat flour have different percentages of protein, different percentages of gluten, and so therefore will act differently as they're baked up. Okay, so this discussion gets much more in depth, but I'll leave it at that at this point. Thank you. All right, next up, is it okay to pre-cook chicken breast partially, then finish later? Answer is yes. We call that par cooking. That can be done in with any method you choose. Okay, grilling, in the oven, in the saute pan, etc., etc. I would like to saute beforehand for about for an hour, then finish cooking in the oven when the company comes. Perfect. Do I put in the refrigerator after I saute them and bring it at to room temperature? So the strict food safety guidelines would say put it in the fridge and be absolutely safe with microorganism multiplication and that sort of thing. Practically speaking, I would probably leave it out at room temp. If it's only 1 hour, that's not a concern in my mind. Some of you are saying, God, I don't want to go eat at his house now. Yeah, you're going to finish cooking it, in a hot oven, and any sort of concern on the surface, like bacteria, will die. So I don't think that's going to be a concern. So I would be apt to leave that at room temperature. Par cooking it in the saute pan is perfect. Finishing it all at once in the oven is very efficient. That's a smart way to do that. All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, next up, what is a good non-dairy substitute for butter to use in gravy? Non-dairy substitute for butter. I'll start by saying I'm not sure because I've never done that. But I'm trying to, brand names aren't coming to mind here, but there are certainly a couple of them, that are in the mainstream at grocery stores, of course. And then, one that I use in baking now is called faba butter. Faba butter. And it's made with coconut oil and aquafaba. Aquafaba. It's bean water. It's a byproduct of simmered chickpeas, and they're not quite mainstream, but you might check them out. They're from Fora Foods, Fora, Fora Foods, called Faba butter. All right, thank you. Next up, how can I get a chart of cooking temperatures? Most of the times it's is difficult for me to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Thank you. Rosa, I don't recall that we have a chart in particular, but you can certainly take a look online at the formula for converting, right, from Celsius to Fahrenheit or Fahrenheit to Celsius, so that you can, you can make that calculation yourself. Okay. And just do a quick Google search, and that'll be a quick one for you. All right. Next up, I often find that I need a sauce to bring a meal together. Are there a few standard sauces that you would recommend mastering? And if so, what types of meals would they be best for? For instance, what type of sauce would complement a seafood recipe? Wow, Judy, this is really a wide open question. And a lot of these sorts of questions depend on two things in my mind. One is tradition around a preparation, and number two is personal preference. And so, a seafood recipe could be bound by a white sauce that's sort of creamy in nature. It could be bound with a tomato-based sauce. It could be bound with a lighter broth that could be vegetable-based, could be seafood-based, that acts as a sauce. So it really depends. But I'm giving you hints, I guess, of what comes to mind for me if I'm in that position. It's pretty, I think, it can be quick to put together a white sauce, either based on dairy products, if milk, half and half, heavy cream, and you can adjust the consistency with water if you only have heavy cream and you want something thinner. You can always thicken milk, right, with cornstarch slurry if you want it to be a little bit thicker in consistency like heavy cream. If you got cashew nuts in the house, you can put those in the blender and make a quick cashew white sauce for something that's going to be plant-based. You can introduce some garlic and spices and flavor that up in a way that will complement the other components in that dish. And then tomato-based recipes, whether it's thin or a little bit thicker and clingier, can be done with a combination of tomato products. We typically use a combination of products. Tomato paste for intense tomato flavor, tomato puree for a moderate tomato flavor. We combine one or both of those with fresh tomatoes for some lighter lighter consistency, as well as lighter flavor on the palate in terms of that freshness that comes through. And then, of course, that can be further complicated or made interesting, with the addition of mirepoix and other spices. So those two categories come to mind first for me, creamy sort of white sauces and also tomato as a category. All right, thank you. All right, Trish asks, what's the best way to judge freshness of beef with bones when you purchase? Bones need to be more white and avoid if they are dark gray. Is this basically like fresh fish, clear eyes, not cloudy? What about pork bones? I think, in terms of, again, using all of our senses, or at least most of them to the extent that we can at a grocery store, color is part of that. Any sort of meat starts to oxidize, blood starts to oxidize. And so you see some darkening, of the cut. Which shows that it's been around for a little while, and that little while could be days, and it could be fine, right, in terms of its edibility, but nonetheless, that it's been around for a little bit longer than something that might be brighter in color. Fat will take on yellowish hue as it ages. A big one is going to be aroma, though. And that's probably the most obvious one, right? When you're judging freshness of a product, and even when something looks like it could be good, the aroma will often tell us otherwise, if that's the case. And when something like bones sit around long enough to turn gray, any attached meat likely is going to have a very off smell to it, but otherwise, lighter, brighter colors, whether it's the bone or the meat. Okay, and it depends on the cut as well, how the bone is cut. Sometimes when we get the center of the bone, it has a grayish look to it. So, grayness may not be a bad thing. So we have to look at other aspects of the cut of the bone, of the flesh. But generally, it's a good aroma. It's overall brightness and color, okay, that will indicate freshness. All right, thank you. I'll add one more thing, Trish. As we use our senses, if you have an opportunity to touch the product, tackiness, kind of a sticky tackiness will develop when a lot of bacteria develops on the surface. So sometimes, even when the product doesn't smell bad, it'll have tackiness that develops. You can really feel. Okay, so we'll use all those senses to analyze the food. All right. What are some of your whole food, plant-based Indian recipes? Is it reasonable to use a little oil if recipe calls for it? So use little oil. So yeah, the oil volume of oil is going to be totally up to you, right? If you want to stick with what's typically called for, whether it's no oil or some oil, and you want to adjust up and down, that's totally up to you. Usually that's going to work. And then let's see some, plant-based Indian recipes. Something we had at home just last night was, spinach sag recipe. And this comes in different styles. It could be pureed, it could be rough chopped, but it's going to be oftentimes spinach, but it could well be any other green. It's really open to green leafy vegetables that are simmered with tomatoes, onions, garlic, some spices to give some flavor. And, then that's going to be served with rice. So that's going to be just something super quick. You can certainly add chickpeas or a legume to it to make it more substantial on the palate and nutritionally as well. Or it might be something just legume based. So it could be a black-eyed pea preparation. It could be a chickpea preparation that might be simmered in that curry sort of a style. Okay. So again, you have a flavor base of onions, garlic, oftentimes tomatoes, with spices. Maybe it's a garam masala blend. Maybe it's your own combination of spices. All right. Thank you. Any favorite ways to use okra in recipes? Yeah, sure. You can do sauteed okra. Give it a little Indian spin, where it's going to be sauteed with some onions, garlic, add some ginger, a little bit of chili, and then also some kokum. Kokum is a souring agent, and that goes really nicely with okra. And you can saute that first, and then put a lid on it, and then just let it gently cook all the way through. And that's very nicely eaten with flatbreads or rice. Thanks. I really appreciate your thorough and thoughtful answers to all of our questions, especially to my many questions today. Thank you. Carol, you're welcome. Thanks so much for your contributions today. I really appreciate it. And next up, I have found a Trader Joe's soy creamer that I enjoy in my coffee. I'm wondering about the health factor of some ingredients like organic maltodextrin, potassium something, I can't even pronounce that, soy lecithin, carrageenan. Try to avoid additives, but this is Jimmy Creamer. So, a great question, right? So many of our plant-based substitutes today are processed foods that have a whole bunch of additional ingredients added to them. And certainly if you're buying these in a carton from a grocery store, they're going to include stabilizers, gums, and preservatives of some sort or another. And so, what's the health effect of these? Well, they're maybe not ideal in my opinion, but the tolerance of that is going to be a personal call. Okay, 100%. It's convenience that we're buying at that point. Now, with some of these products, I have for example, an archived live event on plant-based milks. I talk a little bit about the additives, and it's very easy to make. You talk about creamers here, but in terms of plant-based milks, they're very easy to make at home. And you don't have to add any stabilizers and preservatives to them. The trade-off is the inconvenience. You have to make them yourself, and the shelf life can be very, very short. It could be just a matter of 3 or 4 days versus a couple of weeks sometimes for the equivalent store-bought product. So there's definitely a trade-off. But if optimal health, right, is your goal, then you need to figure out what's going to be best for your situation. But convenience is very important to us, every one of us. But there's a trade-off, and I think it's important to understand and recognize that. All right, thank you. All right, so some brands that sell ground hing may contain wheat. That could be the warning for gluten-free consumers. Okay, excellent. Okay, good. So perhaps that is the warning from the earlier question that came up. Is hing that contains wheat, in case we're talking about an allergy concern. All right, thank you. Next up, just FYI, Le Creuset held true to their lifetime warranty for me and replaced mine after 20 years of wear. Awesome. So for the Le Creuset folks out there asking questions about their tired cookware, reach out to the company and see if their lifetime warranty applies. And it looks like we might be up against our last question here from John. I was given 10 pounds of watermelon seeds, roasted and salted. Unsure what to do with them. Short of eating them whole as a snack. Any ideas? Wow, I would love to have 10 pounds of roasted and salted watermelon seeds. I would put these into quick breads, like you would pumpkin seeds or walnuts or sesame seeds. I would finish off a stir fry, like I often do with sesame seeds for a nice little crunch and all that other added, the phytonutrients that come along with that. Wow, I might be apt to throw a fistful into my smoothie. I put everything into a smoothie. And I think you're going to enjoy a little bit of texture, maybe, along with the flavor subtly, as well as the added nutrients from that product. So those are some ideas, John. Give that a try and see how you like it. All right. Well, that's it for today, folks. Thanks so much for sticking this out with me. I really appreciate all the questions and look forward to seeing you again here in just a couple of weeks for my next session of office hours. Until then, happy cooking. Thanks.